It began the way most problems begin in a quiet neighborhood. Not with an argument, not with raised voices, but with something so small you'd almost feel foolish caring about it. And honestly, at first I nearly did ignore it. The first time I noticed it, it was nothing more than a damp t-shirt draped over my backyard fence, as if it had always belonged there, as if my property had quietly become an extension of someone else's laundry day. For a moment I actually laughed, because the whole thing seemed ridiculous, until it became clear it wasn't going anywhere. My name is Evan Miller, and I've lived in the Oak Ridge subdivision long enough to know every sound that belongs there. Every dog bark, every sprinkler that clicks on a few minutes too soon. It's the kind of place where life is supposed to stay steady, quiet, contained within its own borders. But that year, something began drifting across a line that was never meant to be crossed. And at first, it wasn't loud at all. It was just cloth. I remember that particular morning clearly. I was letting my dog out, coffee still warm in my hand, only half awake, when a strange scent hit me. Detergent mixed with wet grass. Curiosity, or maybe instinct, pulled me toward the back fence. And there it was, laid out neatly across the wood, as though someone had placed it there with care. Not blown by the wind. Not an accident. Set there deliberately. I told myself it must have drifted over from next door, the kind of small mix-up you correct once and forget. So that's what I did. Picked it up, tossed it back over the fence, and went on with my morning. But 2 days later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't a shirt. It was a towel, folded almost too precisely, resting on my side of the fence as if it were waiting for me to find it. That's when something in me shifted, because wind doesn't fold anything. Wind doesn't place things with intention. Wind is chaos, and this felt like order. Next door lived a family I barely knew past a polite wave now and then. A man named Carlos Reyes, his wife, and what seemed like half a dozen kids constantly moving through their small yard like a machine that never stopped generating noise or laundry. I started noticing details I'd overlooked before. Their clothesline was short and always overloaded, while mine stretched longer, caught more sun, more breeze, nearly perfect for drying anything. Slowly, I understood the logic behind it, even if I didn't like it. It wasn't random anymore. It was convenient. And convenience has a way of quietly outweighing respect if nobody puts a stop to it. First it was socks, small enough to overlook. Then jeans, hanging like they had more right to my yard than theirs. Then one morning I stepped outside to find a bedsheet stretched across 2 full fence panels, shifting gently in the wind like a flag staking claim to ground that wasn't its own. I stood there far longer than I should have, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, more a slow, sinking realization that my space had begun to feel shared without ever being asked. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. In a neighborhood like Oak Ridge, nobody wants to be that neighbor, the one who complains about everything. So I tried to reason it away. Maybe it's just carelessness. Maybe they don't realize how far it reaches. Maybe it'll stop on its own. But it didn't stop. Kept building in small, steady increments, like a habit quietly forming. And what struck me most was how ordinary it seemed on their side of the fence, while on mine, it felt more invasive by the day. One afternoon, with friends over in the backyard, one of them asked if I'd taken up hanging laundry outside myself, since there was a row of socks strung along the fence like some kind of decoration. I laughed it off, but underneath, it bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because it meant that even in perception, my yard no longer felt fully mine, whatever the property line said. Eventually, I decided to say something, not as a confrontation, just neighbor to neighbor. One evening, I found Carlos outside fixing something by his patio, and I brought it up casually. I mentioned noticing clothes ending up on my fence and suggested we could both be a little more mindful. He smiled, almost like I'd made a joke he didn't quite agree with, and said sometimes things just spill over when there's a lot of laundry to dry, as if it were weather, as if it were gravity, as if none of it was anyone's choice. I stood there turning that phrase over, spill over, because spilling over is accidental. It doesn't come with clothespins clipped neatly along the top edge of a fence. And I'd begun noticing those 2 small plastic clips appearing on my side of the wood like fingerprints of intent. I didn't argue. I didn't press the point. I just nodded and went home, because I've always believed most things can be resolved without turning them into something bigger. But that night, I sat on my back porch far longer than usual, watching the fence line, unable to shake the sense that something had quietly shifted between two properties that used to feel separate. Over the following week, I hoped it would simply fade. I even convinced myself it already had. Then one morning I woke to find another bedsheet hanging there, fully spread and clipped securely in place, as though it belonged. That was the moment I understood I wasn't dealing with an accident anymore. I was dealing with an assumption, and assumptions are far harder to undo than mistakes. I didn't want this to turn into a feud. I truly didn't, because in neighborhoods like ours, once things escalate, they tend to stay that way. But I couldn't keep ignoring the slow erosion of something as basic as a boundary. So I stopped thinking about it emotionally and started thinking about it practically. If I couldn't convince them to stop, I'd have to make it impossible for it to continue. And that's the thought where everything began to change. Though at the time, I had no idea how far I'd end up going just to reclaim a piece of what was mine. I wish I could say I handled it with some dramatic moment, some clear breaking point where I stood in the yard and declared enough was enough. But real life doesn't usually hand you that kind of clean turning point. It's more a slow buildup of small frustrations, until one day you notice you're thinking about your fence more than you're thinking about your own home. After that morning, when I found the bedsheet clipped perfectly across my side as if it had been given permission to hang there, I stopped viewing it as harmless. Harmless doesn't repeat itself. Harmless doesn't come with an intent that quietly steps past every boundary you try to draw. I tried once more to be reasonable, I really did. I told myself maybe they just needed something plain and unmistakable. So I made a small sign for my side of the fence. Nothing harsh, just clean lettering on a whiteboard reading, "Please do not hang items on this fence." I remember standing there looking at it, thinking this is ridiculous, a grown man posting a sign about laundry, but still hoping it would do the job. For a few days, it actually did. I let myself relax again, even wondered if I'd overreacted, if Carlos had been right and it really was just spillover. But that comfort didn't last. On the 6th or 7th day, I got home from running errands and there it was again. Another large sheet, this time stretched so evenly across the fence it looked deliberate, like someone had studied the wood and figured out exactly how to use it. My sign was still there, tilted slightly by the wind, completely ignored. Something in me shifted then, not into anger, but into clarity. Once a polite request gets ignored, you're no longer dealing with a misunderstanding, you're dealing with behavior. I didn't go back over there. I didn't want another conversation that would end in a polite brush-off. Instead, that evening, I walked the fence line slowly, studying it like a problem to solve rather than something to feel upset about. And I noticed something I'd overlooked before. The top of my fence was flat, smooth wood, practically built for clipping things onto it. No amount of talking was going to change the fact that my fence simply worked better for their laundry than theirs did. That's when the idea arrived. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical, almost boring in its simplicity. I didn't need to argue with them or win them over. I just needed to take away the advantage. The next morning, I drove to a hardware store on Maple Street, the kind of place that smells like sawdust and metal, and asked for a vinyl fence cap. Nothing elaborate, just a smooth, rounded topper meant to protect wood from sun and rain. The clerk didn't ask a single question, just nodded like people walk in solving invisible problems all the time. Back home, I installed it section by section along the shared stretch of fence, measuring, pressing, securing each piece. I remember feeling calm the whole time, not because I was beating anyone, but because I was finally acting on something that didn't depend on someone else agreeing to cooperate. The fence looked different right away, cleaner, more finished. But what mattered was the shape. What used to be a flat surface built for holding clothespins was now curved and smooth, almost designed to shed anything that tried to cling to it. I didn't announce what I was doing. It didn't feel like a statement, just upkeep, fixing something that had quietly become a nuisance. A couple of days later, from my kitchen window, I noticed Carlos in his yard, looking toward my fence a beat longer than usual. Not angry, just puzzled, like he was trying to work out why it wasn't behaving the way it used to. I went back to what I was doing and didn't dwell on it. The first real test came that same afternoon. A small towel showed up on my side again, likely out of habit more than anything. But this time it didn't stay. Slid slowly at first. I remember the first morning I stepped outside and saw nothing there. I actually paused a beat longer than usual, almost checking to confirm it was real. It sounds strange saying it out loud, since it's just laundry, just fabric, just a fence. But over time it had quietly become something more in my mind. A small daily interruption I'd started bracing for, even when I didn't want to. When it stopped, it didn't just take away objects. It lifted a layer of tension I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. Carlos and I never really talked about it directly after that. No meaningful conversation. No "hey, sorry about that" moment. No acknowledgement that anything had shifted. Just the natural drift back into ordinary neighbor routine. A nod in passing, short practical exchanges. Oddly enough, that was fine with me, because sometimes closure in real life isn't a conversation. It's simply the absence of repetition. A couple weeks later, I noticed something new on their side of the yard. Carlos had put up another clothesline closer to the house. Sturdier this time, properly tensioned, clearly built with intention rather than improvised. I watched from my kitchen window as he and his son adjusted it in silence, never glancing at my fence, never acknowledging anything beyond their own space. Just solving their own problem the right way this time. There was something almost neutral in that moment. No resentment, no satisfaction. Just two systems recalibrating after one option stopped being available. That's when it struck me in a way I hadn't expected. This had never really been about laundry. It had been about default behavior, about what people do when an easy option sits in front of them requiring no permission, and how quickly easy turns into normal if nothing interrupts it soon enough. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. That word doesn't fit a situation like this. There was no opponent in any real sense, just overlapping convenience and blurred boundaries. What I'd actually done wasn't defeat something, it was remove access. That distinction stuck with me more than anything else, because looking back, it made the whole thing feel less emotional and more mechanical. The problem didn't end because anyone changed their mind. It ended because the environment stopped supporting it. A few weeks after that, we had people over for a normal evening. Music low, grill going, conversation drifting. At some point a friend mentioned the backyard felt unusually calm, like it had a balance it hadn't had before. I nearly laughed, because nothing physical had changed except one very specific pattern disappearing. Even I noticed it in how I moved through the yard. Less unconscious checking, fewer small flickers of irritation I hadn't realized were piling up, just more ease. Carlos stepped out briefly that evening too, not about anything related to the past, just asking after a soccer ball that had rolled over, and I tossed it back over the fence without a second thought. That simple motion, which once carried a strange emotional weight, now felt completely ordinary again, like it always should have been. Months passed that way. Nothing unusual, nothing escalating, nothing resurfacing. Honestly, I nearly stopped thinking about it altogether, which is probably the closest thing to resolution most situations like this get in real life. They don't end with closure. They just fade out of relevance. Then one evening, long after I'd mentally moved past it, I noticed Carlos standing near his side of the fence, not doing anything in particular, just looking at it in a way that felt reflective rather than practical, as if remembering an earlier version of it that no longer existed. When he noticed me, he gave a small nod and said something almost offhand. Funny how a fence can feel like nothing until it stops doing what you expect. I just stood there for a moment, not really responding, because there wasn't much to add. It wasn't an accusation, wasn't an apology, just an observation that landed somewhere in the middle of hindsight and understanding. After that, there wasn't much else to say between us, and I think that was the closest we ever came to acknowledging the whole situation without reopening it. Just a quiet, shared awareness that something had happened, had changed how things worked for a while, and then stopped. Later that night, I sat outside alone. Same chair, same yard, same fence in front of me, but my mind wasn't on frustration anymore. It had settled on something quieter, the realization that most conflicts like this don't start as conflicts at all. They start as convenience, then repetition, then assumption, and only later become something people actually argue about. I kept turning over how differently it could have gone if I'd chosen confrontation over adjustment, emotion over structure. It might have turned into something personal, something lasting between neighbors who otherwise had no real reason to dislike each other. Or maybe it wouldn't have, maybe words would have solved it faster than changes did. I'll never know, and that uncertainty is part of why it still sits with me. What I do know is that the solution never felt like justice or revenge or even resolution. It felt like altering the conditions so the behavior no longer made sense. And that idea has stayed with me longer than the situation itself, because it reaches beyond this one dispute. I still find myself thinking, sometimes not about who was right or wrong, but about how many everyday tensions exist simply because the environment lets them keep repeating, and whether most of them would vanish on their own if the easiest path just stopped being there.